Tonight on Free Minds TV, we'll be talking about the healthcare system. We'll also be discussing the stock market. Would it have been a good buy 10 years ago or not? Plus, we have some good news coming out of Washington, D.C., where Ron Paul is going to be heading up a committee. We'll tell you what that committee is going to be up to. That plus a whole lot more coming up tonight on Free Minds TV.
Thank you for tuning in to episode 186 of Free Minds TV, where we challenge you, the viewer, to think outside the box. As always, it is Toby here with you.
And Nick.
And Nick, as we approach the holiday season here, it seems the world of politics and the world of government and the social affairs of the world, well, they're just going right into the toilet.
Well, they've been circling the bowl for probably... Really, since it's amazing to think about. It's been over 2 years since the financial crisis started.
Sure.
So we're headed into the third year of an economic downturn, and it really isn't getting a whole lot better. People are saying things are getting better, at least looking at financial markets and things like that. But for the average person, the unemployment rate's still high. It's going to be there a long time. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a whole host of problems you can talk about. So if anything, we may actually be worse off than we were a year ago.
Yeah, it's interesting. Before the show, we were talking about how we've been doing this show for a number of years now. We're still fairly young, but we started doing the show when we were really young. And from the beginning, even though when the economy was really doing well, Nick, we were talking about how the policies that were being put into place were really going to come back and bite us in the butt, so to speak, and how it wasn't sustainable, and how you can't just continue having these big government programs. And
for a while, I thought we were probably just crazy people.
Yeah, that's what we were saying right before we started the show. It's like a couple of years ago, or 3, 4, 5 years ago.
To watching the show afterwards.
Well, because the economy was doing well, Nick. It was
relatively
well.
Everyone knew that the housing market was in trouble because that bubble kind of started to burst. But no one thought. I don't think anyone really thought that we were headed for something not as big as the Great Depression.
We did. We were saying
huge.
We were predicting this down the line because, well, we looked at history and we saw what things happened. But you're right, Nick. There were some times, thinking back, I don't know, episode 40, 50 there, where are we just blowing steam here? But our predictions came true, which makes me a little bit nervous.
Because our predictions in the future, maybe we just got lucky, which would be nice, because our predictions in the future haven't been too
Exactly.
great.
Our predictions for the future have been grim as well, for going beyond this in the next 2, 5, 10, 15, 20, 50 years down the line. If we're on this current trajectory, just seem to get worse and worse. And I've said it before, I didn't come up with the analogy, but we're kind of like a giant ship headed for that iceberg. And if you move the ship just a little bit when you're real far away, it's easy to avoid that iceberg. And this doesn't matter if you're talking about a financial situation, if you're talking about foreign relations, if you're talking about social programs, whatever it is. If you just nudge it a little bit way out, you're going to miss the iceberg by a mile. But the closer and closer and closer you get to that iceberg, the more you have to correct, or else you're going to ram into it.
And then there's a point where you can crank that wheel all you want.
It doesn't matter. Reverse the engines, go the other direction, and crank the wheel all the way, and it doesn't matter. You're still going to crash. And the question is, Nick, the question we've been asking is, are we already at that point? Is it too late for correction? Can we turn the motors on backwards on the big old ship and change our course and still avoid that iceberg?
Probably. I mean, maybe.
Well,
we're very close to,
are we hitting the iceberg yet? I don't know. It's so hard to tell without perspective of history.
Right. I mean, because we could find out that the whole system falls apart next year. Maybe 2011 is the year where we really realize that the house of cards fell down.
But I don't think that's going to happen.
I don't think it'll happen.
We were
either.
talking on the radio show this past week about how it seems like it's not really a house of cards falling down. It's more like a slow crumble. As more and more middle class get squeezed out and become the lower class, and lower class end up on the street, there's a greater and greater divide between the rich and the poor, and all the resources in the world, all that wealth is being funneled into fewer and fewer hands out there. This isn't something that I think is going to cripple society overnight. It seems that it's been a gradual up to this point, and it's going to be continuing down that road. But how far down that road, is it sustainable? And that's the question that's been on my mind.
It doesn't mean it's going to happen at a glacial pace either. To say it happens gradually doesn't mean that in 10 years
it starts gradually, but then does it pick up speed? How much speed? It's that question out there that I think a lot of people are thinking about. It's a tough question to think about because it makes planning one's future very difficult. Should I invest in stock market? Should I keep my money in gold and just try to outpace inflation? But wait, it seems like gold's almost an investment, because if I invested $10,000 in gold last year, I would be much more wealthy this year because it's just going up, even though. So what do you do? How do you, when you're asking these questions, how do you plan for an uncertain future?
Well, no, you're never going to be able to plan with any certainty. And I think
that's the American dream, though, Nick, is being able to plan for certainty, being able to go get that college degree, get that house, pay that mortgage, that white picket house.
Anymore.
It did for years, though, Nick.
Because we had a relatively stable financial system. But
I'm getting to the point in my life where I've got the white picket fence, I've got the college degree, I'm in the grad school program for the graduate degree, and I'd like to know that there's some stability in that.
Well, stability is good. I mean, that's one of the reasons why, for a very long time, the United States was, without a doubt, the richest country in the world. And we still are, but had a very vibrant middle class. That seems to be going by the wayside. And we're just not going to, we still, by many measures, have one of the most stable financial systems in the world. I don't know where you point to for a better one. Certainly not Mexico, not China. Although China's sort of headed, even though they're unstable, they seem to be headed in the right direction much more quickly than us.
Hong Kong's doing pretty well.
Yeah, Hong Kong and Singapore are doing pretty well, but they're not very good examples. But it's tough to know, Toby, because I think, well, yesterday, we're recording the show on Wednesday, but the Dow came very close to hitting a milestone, which is that it was back to the record high that was set in 1999. That was the record at the time. 11,497, I think, was the number. So if you had invested in the stock market, just not picking stocks, because if you're financially savvy and you can pick companies, obviously you're going to make money. I mean, if you know what you're doing.
Well, if you have the time to put into
and you have the time to put into actually actively managing your money.
Or if you have a financial consultant.
Right, but a lot of people have a 401k or a pension plan that passively invests in things like indexes. So if you had bought the Dow Jones Industrial Average, which a lot of people do, a lot of people out there watching you might own stocks, but you just own the S&P, or you own the Dow, or you own the NASDAQ.
I have some of those, actually.
Yeah. If you had bought the Dow back in 1999 at that high, you'd be at break even right now. There was a point where you could have made a profit, so let's be honest about that. If you had sold when it had hit
and
up
of
in round 14.
And of course, if you had bought the right one, so there's some people out there that did make money because they bought the right one, sold at the right time, or picked wisely, invested in emerging markets.
Well, let's remember, when the tech bubble burst, also late 90s, early aughts, I can remember the NASDAQ being well over 5. Did it hit 6?
I'm not sure.
It's never recovered. The NASDAQ's never recovered. The S&P still hasn't recovered over that 10-year record. The record it had set was like 14 something. I think it's at 12. So if you were passively investing in these stock indexes, well, it is a lost decade. I mean, it's a wash.
Well, especially if you factor in inflation, it's
right,
it's
because
a loss.
The cost of living has gone up. So even
in 10 years,
you could have kept $11,000 in cash, and you would have made no return. It'd be worth less, but you wouldn't have had to take on all the risk of investing in the stock market. Right. So what people are supposed to do, I'm not going to give financial advice. It's very hard to say.
Well, that's what's so upsetting, Nick. I'd like some. And I think that the point is, if you are going to be investing in the stocks, know what you're doing, I think, and either consult with a financial planner or do your homework.
Right. And the other thing I want to point out is that one of the reasons we have so much instability is because of the level of government involvement. Whenever you have the government manipulating markets, constantly changing regulations and laws, if you look at the way those things move the market and the way they distort investment, and then you add what the Federal Reserve does in on top of that, probably even more so than what's done in Congress, what the Fed does dramatically affects markets. And that's one of the reasons we saw the housing boom in the first place.
Too, sometimes people try to guess at what the Fed's going to do, and no one's really
sure.
Well,
we know what they're doing now.
Well, yeah,
they're doing the same thing that got us into the housing bubble, which is they're cheapening the dollar. They're keeping interest rates ridiculously low. They're just buying up bonds. They're just financing government debt directly. Quantitative easing is printing money. That's what it means. It used to be an obscure term that only people like us who mucked around with monetary policy really knew about. But probably more me.
But that,
you find it boring.
But what it does is it makes it so much harder for the average working class person out there to make ends meet. If you're supporting a family or something, a lot of people, I think they, after paying their bills, buying their groceries, paying their debts, of course everybody's got that debt, whether it be credit card, student loan, mortgage, car payments, etc. After paying off all those debts, a lot of families out there only have a couple $100 left for spending cash. And when you're looking at inflation, even a small amount of inflation can quickly eat away at that $100, $200, $300 that's left over. And for people that already are at that line where they don't have it, well, that's going to push people over the edge when you are talking about even small amounts of inflation if their paychecks aren't matched by that fairly quickly.
Yeah, and remember, we still have a high unemployment rate, so if we start to see inflation
without employment going up, because then what's the incentive for businesses to adjust for inflation? And
exactly. If you've actually, for some people, depending on the sector you're in, for a lot of people who are at the lower end of the wage scale and the middle end of the wage scale, your wages have either remained flat over the last few years or they've gone down. In a lot of areas, you make less today than you did 5 years ago doing the same job. It used to be a $12 an hour job. Now it's a $10 an hour job. And we're lucky here in New Hampshire, Toby, because I think our unemployment rate is 5 point something, 5.5, 5.7.
And it's still very competitive, though, Nick. It's still extremely competitive.
It is, but that's great compared to the rest of the country.
Oh, I know.
Where some states are still up over 10.
And that's, we've talked many times about how that 10% unemployment figure is really artificially low, because that's not factoring in people who have given up looking for jobs out there or aren't collecting unemployment anymore.
Well, it also doesn't necessarily count the underemployed. People who used to have a full-time job with health care benefits, now they work 20 hours a week at a lower paying job with no benefits. They have, I mean, they might be employed, but there's no financial security.
It seems, I don't know that much. I'm not pretending to be any kind of an expert in monetary policy or anything like that, but it seems so unwise, so risky, so, need I say, foolhardy to be inflating the dollar like this when unemployment is this high. Because those people who are on the edge, that need to still go buy groceries, that still need to put the tank of gas in their car, make that car payment, make that mortgage payment, make that rent payment, whatever it is, when your cost of living goes up, whether it be gasoline, groceries, whatever it is, your extra income is quickly eaten away, very quickly, because people were already on the edge a year ago, and now they're really on the edge, and it's that inflation number goes up, and that job, your employer doesn't adjust for that. That's really putting people between a rock and a hard place.
I think the fundamental problem here is the real cause, I think, behind the recession that we've seen is that there was an excess of debt in the United States, both on the personal level, with institutions writing these bad mortgages to people who couldn't pay them back, people over-leveraged on their credit cards on top of that. We have a government that's in the red because they just keep spending profligately and they don't actually raise the revenue as they go. So really, the strain on the U.S. financial system that brought us into this crisis, and I think keeps us in it, is the fact that the United States does not produce nearly as much as it used to. It imports most of those goods. Basically, we're living an artificially high lifestyle on borrowed money. And by trying to inflate your way out of that, you're making the problem worse. You're just making the problem worse. So you can pay off the debts, you can monetize them slowly. If you're going to do that, you might as well just print all the money to pay all the debts and start over from scratch.
Well, so that would be essentially like a jubilee, because everybody's debts would be wiped out because, well, my mortgage, for example, I'd be able to pay it back very easily if we had some kind of hyperinflation or something like that.
The better thing to do would be to
deregulate. That's my question here.
Have a stable financial system where the government doesn't spend all this money, where people don't have to wonder what a new health care bill is going to do to their business or something like that, and where you allow the market to work. It'll take time to correct from a big downturn like this. It might have taken the market 2 or 3 years. But I have a feeling that in the end, we're going to be looking back on this economic downturn as a 5 or a 10-year event. Or the beginning of a downward slide.
Yeah, and that's what we were talking about on the last episode of the radio show. Is this a downward slide that is just slowly going to make us a poorer and poorer nation until eventually we're overcome by other nations such as China?
I don't think we'll be
Japan.
overcome militarily.
Well, no, but Nick, it's never a military that destroys a prosperous nation. I mean, Rome taught us that. It's our own doing. It's usually our own bigger government and spending habits that will put a nation at the knees and at the mercy of other nations.
They'll probably just buy us up this time though, instead of burning our capital.
Right, sure.
Just buy it.
Yeah, and then well, that's the other question I have, Nick. You have more information about this. You're more knowledgeable on the subject. Where is this money coming from? I know we print a lot of it through inflation and we borrow it from foreign investors. Are we really borrowing that much money from foreign investors in, say, Japan and in other Asian countries?
No.
Where's it all come from?
The Federal Reserve.
So
the funny thing is the Federal Reserve prints off the money because they're not part of the government. They loan the U.S. government money. And then the taxpayers work to pay back these central bankers, not the government per se.
Who's our debt to? We're in debt almost $14 trillion. Who do we owe that money? That's for about, what, $40-something thousand for every man, woman, and child?
Yeah, most of it's, I mean, there are private investors. There are Americans who own government bonds, whether they're U.S. government debt or state debt or municipals. But most of it, I think about half or more, is the Federal Reserve.
No.
And then you've got foreign investors and private U.S. investors. But most of those private investors are really things like pension funds, hedge funds. The average American owns a tiny percentage of this.
So here's my question, Nick, and this might be naive and stupid. Why do we care about paying them back?
Well, the portion we owe to foreign governments, it gets a little bit dicey because when foreign governments like China get pissed at you over billions or trillions of dollars, that can get ugly. But about half of the debt, as I said, has been financed by the Federal Reserve. They own about half the debt.
I don't care about them. They sound like bad people.
No, they should be shut down, and we should not give. They're inherently fraudulent institutions.
So it sounds like Jubilee goes. Well, yeah.
Right, half the national debt can be forgiven. I think it's more than that. I'll look for the pie chart. Maybe next week we'll have it. But we could get rid of like half the national debt just by not paying. Of course, that would probably make bond market investors nervous. But if you're going to slash the size of the federal government, it doesn't matter because you won't have to borrow money anymore. Imagine that. Running a government that you can afford, not running a government that's bigger than one you can afford.
We've used the analogy many times on the show, Nick, about the credit card and how essentially the government is spending with this credit card. At what point does a family say, well, we've been spending on the credit card to buy groceries now. It's time to put the credit card away and rethink matters?
Well, some families do it at different points than others. Same with countries. The UK has introduced austerity measures. And on this show, for like a year, we basically did one segment every show making fun of the United Kingdom for what a messed up socialist police state they were. They cut their size of government by 19% across the board. The Brits are cutting the size of government. The Swedes let their automaker, they let Saab go out of business. The US is dramatically increasing the size of government, and we let Sweden beat us in the free market arena by allowing the car company that held national pride for them to go under because it was a poorly run company. In the United States, well, Ford ran a better company, but we're going to bail out their competition, and apparently there's no freedom to fail anymore. You can't run a crappy motor company and go out of business. Why didn't we save AMC? Because their cars sucked, and this is supposed to be a free country, and you don't bail out automakers who make crappy, exploding, poorly run cars.
But what about the workers, Nick? It's not their fault. They make poor, bad cars. Shouldn't you think about the workers?
They can get another job. Or Ford can buy the factories and make cars with GM's factories.
Yeah, makes sense to me, but
it's just the way that's the way a market works, isn't it?
But you know, Nick, we also talk a lot about how the government's doing this, the government's doing this, the government's doing this. Well, who's the government?
Who's the government?
Who's the government?
Well, there's some guys in Congress.
There's some guys in Congress. Yeah, I know. But
are you talking about the people that pay them to enact laws?
You know, Nick, I'm more talking about some poll numbers I've been looking at in the papers recently.
Oh, the people.
I'm talking about the people. I think that the people are getting the government they deserve to a certain extent. Just like we all love it when we go out and use that credit card to buy some fancy new electronic or something, go on a spending spree with that credit card. It feels good in that moment too, but it's foolhardy, isn't it? Yet most Americans take part in it at some point in their lives.
They like their program. I mean, this new healthcare bill is pretty popular, even though no one really knows how it's going to be paid for yet. Something we should probably get into that. I guess there's this court ruling that says that the individual mandate, I think it was the Virginia Federal District Court, saying that the individual mandate portion of the health care bill, not the rest of it, but the individual mandate of the new health care bill was unconstitutional. Good news, I agree with the court's interpretation. Unfortunately, there were 2 other courts that have already ruled that it's constitutional. Basically, everyone thinks it's going to the Supreme Court. I have no faith in the court system to actually, when we start talking about interpreting the Constitution, that's where I kind of have a problem. There's really, where is that in enumerated power? Tell me where the Constitution says that the U.S. government, the federal government, will provide health care for citizens. And then I'll say you probably have a constitutional argument.
Or better,
it was very specific about what the federal government was supposed to do.
The issue we're talking about here is making it illegal not to have health insurance.
Right.
And so So the way the health insurance program works is it essentially just says you gotta buy it.
Well, let's not to get too deep into the argument here, but the justification that the courts are offering, the 2 courts that have ruled in favor of this, essentially what they're saying is that they're going with the argument that Congress has the power to regulate interstate commerce, and they're classifying all health insurance as interstate commerce. But under the Commerce Clause, it's basically been ruled by courts in previous cases. The precedent's been set, which I think those rulings have gone way too far. But they say that Congress has the ability to regulate any kind of commercial activity that crosses state lines. And I think they've gone way too far with interstate commerce. That's a separate issue. Even agreeing with that ruling, these courts have gone a step further. The 2 courts that have ruled in favor of the individual mandate have said that Congress has the power to regulate economic inactivity. Not engaging in commerce is an act of commerce. By choosing not to buy insurance or any other product across state lines, the precedent they're setting is that Congress can tell you to buy whatever they want.
What?
That's the justification. However,
that sounds like a 2-year-old logic, Nick.
Right. The court in Virginia
Childish.
said, no, you can't call not engaging in commercial activity commercial activity.
Right, it's the opposite.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
It's logical thinking. These that's all. The court system has largely become a system where they can have these apologists who say, hocus pocus, everything the federal government does
Let's find a way to craft these words in a way that makes it come out the way we want
it to. It's just word vomit coming out of their mouths. I mean, it's nonsense to say that not engaging in commerce is engaging in commerce.
That's insane.
And so that they'll regulate inactivity, which means they can tell you to buy health insurance, they can tell you to buy homeowners insurance, they can tell you to buy life insurance if they wanted to.
You know what's interesting? Do you think that when all the people, we're talking about going back to governments, who's responsible here? The people. I do blame a large part of it on the people because it is the people who fall for these things or want these things. I'm not really sure. And I know it's not all of you out there, but we live in a democracy, so it's at least a majority of the people who go out and...
limited republic.
Okay, but let's...
It works as a democracy.
It works as a democracy, Nick. And the politicians put their finger up in the wind and take that poll number, and that's what they're going to be basing their position on a lot of the time, or whatever money's behind them. But that's plays into the poll numbers as well, as you're getting more and more complicated with how the human psyche works and how people are influenced one way or the other. But when people, the majority, let's say, or at least enough vocal people wanted this government-run health insurance, do you think that they thought they were getting something for free, or do they think that they thought the solution would be what it came to and said, the solution is you have to buy it or you're going to be fined?
It would be more cost-effective to completely socialize the system.
Right.
I would rather see Canada Care, where it's just comes out of your paycheck, you got all the health care you want, government runs it, instead of this system where, well, you have to buy private insurance, and then these private companies make a profit off of you. I would rather have just commie care.
It seemed all
honestly,
convoluted.
I almost think that was the plan. To some extent, was it some proponents of single payer knew they couldn't get it, but they knew that this will break the back of it because we will get single payer out of this eventually. This is going to make healthcare more expensive.
Of course.
And it's already too expensive for most Americans. So what are we going to get? We're going to get either we're going to win and government's going to get out of healthcare, or we're going to get Canada Care.
Well, I think the only way government's going to get out of healthcare is when they go bankrupt, and then they won't be able to provide it anymore. They can continue to say, hey, well, you need to buy it. Well, I guess that's...
bottle of whiskey and a needle and thread for everyone.
For a lot of people, what it means is you have to buy it, and if you don't, it just comes out of your taxes as a fine or an extra. I don't know.
They call it a penalty.
A penalty. Okay, if it comes out of my paycheck, Nick, I'm going to call it a fine.
There is there is some good news coming out of Washington. I do want to get to it before we run out of time. Back to the whole Federal Reserve thing, because I think the Fed, if you really look into what having a central bank around does, I think it really allows this enormous government that we have to exist and to grow in the way that it does, putting the people in debt. So if you haven't looked into how our monetary system works, if you don't really know what backs a dollar, it's nothing, by the way, but if you don't really know what a US dollar is except a piece of paper that you hand to people in exchange for goods, look into it. I'm not going to tell you what books to read or what websites to read, but find out how the U.S. monetary system works. I think a lot of you might be surprised. But it could be working differently if we do get rid of the Federal Reserve. The odds of that are not great, but they got a little bit better because Representative Ron Paul of Texas, who has authored a bill to end the Federal Reserve and audit the Federal Reserve, will take control of the House subcommittee that oversees the Federal Reserve. This is like...
That's weird.
This is like...
Never thought this would happen, Nick.
No,
this is a prediction we did not have. I think we addressed this and we were like, yeah, that'll happen.
It was like, that'd be sweet. So something good could come out of this. House Financial Services Chairman-elect Spencer Baucus, an Alabama Republican, selected Paul 75 to lead the panel's Domestic Monetary Policy Subcommittee when their party takes a House majority next month. Probably the one good thing that's really going to come out of the Republicans taking control.
Not to say that the Democrats were doing a good job. I just want to make that clear, too, before the emails start striking us.
Suck. Ron Paul's really one of the few. Pretty much the only congressman that I would want to vote for, unless they were up against somebody really awful. And they point out that this subcommittee is the same team that crafted the first comprehensive financial reform bill to put an end to the bailouts, to unwind them, to wind down the taxpayer funding of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and enforce a strong audit of the Federal Reserve. So good things have come out of this subcommittee already.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll have to keep an eye on it. It will definitely be interesting, Nick.
Yeah.
We are out of time. If you have different solutions, different thoughts on this, we'd love to hear them. fmtv@freemindstv.com is the email. Are we done? I see blue on the screen. I don't know if we're here anymore, but hey, there we are. Have a great night. freemindsmedia.org. Until next week, have a good one.